What began as a political response to the war in Ukraine has now evolved into a complex and high-stakes financial problem for Europe. More than 2 years after Russian sovereign assets were frozen by Western powers, European governments remain deeply divided over a critical question: can or should those funds be confiscated to support Ukraine's defense and reconstruction? Behind public statements of unity and unwavering support, a far more cautious and contentious debate is unfolding. Several European Union member states have privately urged the United States to discourage any move toward the outright seizure of these assets. Their hesitation is not rooted in political sympathy for Moscow. Instead, it is a calculated decision based on rigorous risk management and a profound concern for the stability of Europe's own financial architecture. To understand Europe's cautious stance, one must first grasp the sheer scale of its exposure. Globally, it is estimated that roughly 300 billion euros in Russian central bank assets are currently frozen. A significant majority of these funds, believed to be well over 2/3, are not held in the United States, but are instead located within the European financial system. These assets are primarily held through major clearing and custody institutions based in Belgium, making the country and its financial infrastructure the epicenter of this unprecedented geopolitical dilemma. This concentration means that Europe's exposure is not merely incidental. It is structural and deeply embedded within its financial plumbing. This structural reality places Europe in a fundamentally different position than its American allies. Unlike the United States, which faces comparatively limited counter risk, European banks, corporations, and pension funds hold substantial assets and investments that remain inside Russia. Estimates of this exposure run into several hundred billion euros, creating a web of financial interdependencies that cannot be easily unwound. Any unilateral decision by Europe to confiscate Russian sovereign assets would almost certainly trigger swift and severe legal and economic retaliation from Moscow. The Kremlin would likely move to seize European corporate assets on its territory, creating a direct and immediate financial shock for some of Europe's largest companies and their investors. For European policymakers, this is not a distant or abstract threat, but a direct risk to their economies, their financial institutions, and the savings of their citizens. Beyond the immediate threat of economic retaliation, the proposed confiscation of sovereign assets presents a formidable legal and market problem for Europe. The bedrock principles of international law offer limited and ambiguous precedent for seizing the sovereign reserves of another state outside the context of a formal negotiated peace settlement. For generations, sovereign immunity has been a cornerstone of the global financial system, ensuring that central bank assets are protected from politically motivated seizure. Financial institutions across Europe, particularly those tasked with safeguarding global reserves, worry that crossing this long-established line could have cascading and irreversible consequences. Their primary concern is that such an action would severely undermine Europe's long-standing reputation as a secure and neutral custodian of global reserves. For decades, countries from around the world have placed their trust and their capital in European financial centers, confident that their assets would be protected by the rule of law, irrespective of shifting political alliances. A unilateral seizure of Russian assets would shatter that trust. Furthermore, it could significantly increase the long-term funding costs for European governments and corporations. As global investors begin to demand a higher risk premium for holding euro-denominated debt, perhaps most damagingly, it could accelerate a strategic diversification away from euro-denominated assets by major reserve-holding nations, particularly those outside the traditional Western Bloc. For countries in Asia, the Middle East, and the Global South, the message would be stark and unambiguous. Political alignment, not legal principle, now determines the security of your assets. That is not a message Europe's financial sector can afford to send if it wishes to maintain its central role in the global economy. In this complex geopolitical calculus, the role of the United States is pivotal, and its position is largely a reflection of geography and balance sheet realities. Washington's financial system is simply less vulnerable to direct retaliation from Moscow. The U.S. holds a much smaller fraction of the frozen Russian assets, and its corporate and banking exposure inside Russia is significantly more limited than that of Europe. This relative insulation gives Washington greater strategic flexibility and allows it to advocate for more aggressive measures with fewer direct consequences for its own economy. However, by publicly urging caution and acknowledging the legal and financial risks involved, the U.S. effectively helps to reduce systemic risk for the entire Western alliance. For some European governments, quiet American pressure to avoid outright confiscation provides a convenient external constraint, allowing them to resist a policy that is internally divisive and economically perilous, all while maintaining a strong public front of transatlantic unity. The intense debate over Russian assets does more than just expose a transatlantic divergence. It highlights deeper structural fault lines within the European Union itself. The crisis has laid bare the uneven financial exposure that exists among member states, with countries whose institutions hold the bulk of the assets facing a disproportionately higher level of risk. This has created a growing and palpable tension between the political imperative of demonstrating solidarity with Ukraine and the fiscal responsibility of protecting national economies and financial systems. As the war extends into its third year, there is a weak and fragmenting consensus on the level of long-term economic sacrifice that member states are willing to endure. This fracturing is occurring against a backdrop of slowing economic growth, persistent inflation, and tightening public finances across the continent. In this environment, the political tolerance for open-ended and potentially catastrophic financial commitments is rapidly declining. The core of the issue is shifting. The debate is becoming less about the political will to support Ukraine, and more about the economic sustainability of the methods used to provide that support. Policymakers are being forced to confront the practical limits of their financial power and the potential for unintended consequences could harm Europe more than they punish Russia. Given this intricate web of legal, financial, and political constraints, what comes next? The most probable path forward is a continuation of the current, more cautious approach. Europe will likely continue to utilize the interest, income, and profits generated by the frozen Russian assets, channeling these funds to Ukraine without touching the principal. This strategy, while generating smaller sums than outright confiscation, effectively minimizes the legal risk and avoids triggering the most severe forms of Russian retaliation. It also preserves the frozen principal as powerful leverage for any future peace negotiations, where the assets could be used as a critical bargaining chip. But this pragmatic compromise also underscores a reality that policymakers are often reluctant to state openly. In this high-stakes financial confrontation, Europe may have already reached the limit of what it is willing to risk. For global investors and financial markets, the issue is no longer one of geopolitical symbolism or moral resolve. It is transformed into a fundamental question of predictability, legal continuity, and, most importantly, trust in the integrity and stability of Europe's core financial infrastructure. The outcome of this debate will send a powerful signal about the continent's commitment to the international rule of law in an era of intensifying great power competition. In that sense, the Russian asset debate is not simply a test of Europe's political resolve against Moscow, it is a stress test of its own financial credibility on the world stage.